Recently, the great British historian Tom Holland gave a lecture entitled Why I Changed My Mind About Christianity. Holland is the author of Dominion, a book that lays out the Christian creation of Western culture. I have a 12-part summary of the book, which I link below. Holland begins his lecture by talking about his growing up in a country steeped in Christian culture, the United Kingdom. His dad was an atheist, but his mother was a Christian, and his godmother was a devout Christian and his moral exemplar. He enjoyed reading the Bible. He loved the excitement of Old Testament stories. But he admits he tended to side with the villains. He liked Goliath. He liked Pharaoh. They were glamorous and powerful, not like those scruffy Israelites. He liked the Old Testament more than the New Testament, but when reading the New Testament, he found himself on the side of Pontius Pilate and the Romans. Quote, I liked the big and powerful, the glamorous. Jesus and the apostles were not. The glamour, the swagger, the charisma of the ancient world seduced me. When I chose my career as a historian, I chose to write about the Greeks and Romans. I didn't believe in Christianity anymore. End quote. But he says that as he studied the Romans and Greeks, it became increasingly unsettling. When Caesar conquered Gaul, it was a horrendous narrative. He killed 1 million and enslaved another 1 million. The Romans did not consider this a crime, but a great achievement. The Spartans built their society on the backs of slaves. He found this disturbing. The Nazis found in the Spartans their blueprint for the enslavement of Eastern Europe. Children were inspected. If found wanting, they would be liquidated. He began to ask himself, why do I find this unsettling? Nobody in those ancient societies were bothered in the least by mass murder and brutality. It wasn't only in ethics and morals that he found a growing chasm between himself and the ancient world. It was also in the realm of ideas, their understanding of religion. There was no division between religion and the rest of life. He said he began to ask himself, where did the idea of religion come from? In the ancient world, there was a bond that joined you to the gods. A sacrifice, a festival, a set of rituals. But it doesn't mean what it means today. What changed? Holland says Christianity came along. And Christianity was the first, and so far as I know, only religion to separate religion and the state, religion and the rest of life. When Rome was sacked in 411 AD, the pagans blamed it on the Christians for abandoning the old beliefs. This is when Augustine weighed in. And in my mind, by the way, Augustine is the second most important person in history after Jesus. Augustine said there is the secular, a realm where things are born and doomed to die. The secular is where nothing is forever, where all is decay. The counterpoint is heaven, where all is eternal. Christ provides the bond to the eternal. Christians come to understand that the secular and the religious operate in two dimensions. Augustine called it two cities. This is exactly how people in the modern West understand things today, but the ancients wouldn't have understood. Our thinking about religion and life is totally Christian, even in the minds of people who claim not to be Christian, or claim not to believe in God, or not to believe in Christ. So Holland began to think, how profound was the Christian Revolution, not just in the West, but everywhere. So he decided to write Dominion to gauge how total this revolution was, how totally changed was the West, how Christian does the West remain. He used the analogy that we are goldfish swimming in Christian waters. We don't know how Christian we are. So Holland wanted to trace how we came to be this way. As with so many personal conversion stories, it wasn't just an intellectual struggle. He was also informed by a powerful personal experience. In 2014, He had written 2 or 3 chapters of Dominion when he was invited by the BBC to go to Iraq with a film crew to report on ISIS. He went to Sinjar, a city in northern Iraq which had been historically Christian. ISIS had conquered the city and had crucified many of the Christian men and enslaved the women. He went to Sinjar a few weeks after it had been recaptured by Iraq, and it was in an appalling state. He went into churches that had been desecrated by ISIS, and it became clear that what was really offensive to them was the cross. He said, quote, "And as I stood there, I realized the terrifying thought that the cross for these people did not have the significance it did for me or the society I had grown up in. For the Islamic State, the cross symbolized their right to do whatever they wanted to people. And I realized that this is what it had meant to the Romans, their right to torture to death anyone who defied them." End quote. Holland says the horror of this opened up a great spiritual abyss. He came back to England and rewrote the introduction to Dominion to focus on the crucifixion. Quote, "That experience had sharpened for me the utter strangeness, the weirdness, that the great marker of Christian identity was an instrument of torture." End quote. Holland notes the early Christians felt the same way as well. Paul is haunted by the strangeness of the cross. The Son of God came to earth and suffered the most monstrous punishment the Roman Empire could inflict upon a person. It wasn't just painful, it was public and humiliating. Paul admits in his letters that crucifixion was foolish and scandalous to his readers. But that's what he said the Messiah endured for our sakes. This fact caused anxiety among not just Paul, but the early Christians across the Roman world. They knew that Christ had chosen this death, but they simply could not depict it in their art. It's not until 400 years later that we begin to get art that shows Christ on the cross. Holland became aware that Christians in the West have become anesthetized to Christ's suffering on the cross. We are desensitized to what crucifixion meant. That's why going to Sinjar was such a jolt. Holland was asked, what is the most radical thing about Christianity? He said there are 2 things. First, that all human beings have equal worth and value, the sanctity of life. And second, the message of the cross is that it is better to suffer than inflict suffering. Quote, "Christianity is a depth charge detonating under our assumptions, arguing that suffering, humility, and sacrifice are the preeminent values. This is what makes Christianity utterly, utterly revolutionary." End quote. Christianity is the seedbed of everything that makes the West what it is. Then Holland says, without it, I worry about where we may end up. And that's an excellent topic for a future video. Tom Holland realized that in the warp and woof of his existence, he was Christian. And that realization brought him back to the Christian faith. Thanks for listening. May the Christ of the cross bless you mightily this day.